Today I'm going to be talking about live betting college basketball. Certainly when it comes to live betting, there are some things that transfer from one sport to another, but there are enough nuances and differences that I think it's worth talking about one sport at a time. I mean, even between college basketball and the NBA, there are enough significant differences that I would approach it a little bit differently. So some things I say in this video, you can probably transfer to other sports, but I'm going to be talking specifically about college basketball here. I'm probably going to say the words college basketball a lot. So no drinking games with that. Wouldn't go over well. In this video, I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to talk about why you would live bet college basketball. And yes, you probably kind of know the reason, but I think there's more to it than what you might be thinking of. Second, I'm going to talk about a couple things to consider, then some tips for live betting college basketball. And then last, I'm going to give you one specific strategy that I use that hopefully you could take and put to some good use yourself. All of those things are time-stamped in the description. So if you really only want to listen to one part of that, feel free to jump to whatever it is that you want to hear. But if you're going to hang with me for the whole thing, let's jump in and talk about this stuff. So first up, why would you live bet college basketball? Well, the no duh answer, yes, I'm old. That's what we said when I was in middle school. No duh. The no duh answer is to get a better line. Of course, when you're live betting, you want to get a better line. We all know that. But there's a little more to it underneath of why you would do it. So number one, especially if you watch a decent amount of college basketball, you can start to get a feel for the game. Every game goes a little bit differently. And certainly, obviously, they don't always go the way we expect. And so when you're watching a game, you're able to get a sense of how things are progressing and what that might mean for the rest of the game. Now, obviously, you can still be wrong, but I do think that there is an edge to be had in watching the first 5 to 10 minutes of a game and getting a sense of how things look on that specific night. The second reason you might live bet is to see who's playing. A lot of times you'll know ahead of time who's playing and who's not, but there can be last minute decisions or people who were supposed to be in and then something goes wrong in warmups. A great example of this, and it can make a big difference. I think even a bigger difference in college basketball than in the pros. Great example of this is the other night, Minnesota and Iowa were playing. Well, Dawson Garcia is Minnesota's best player, and he's been out for 4 games straight. He was a game time decision. If he plays, it makes a big difference. He ended up sitting out, and that's a game I'm probably going to reference later because I had a bet in that game. And actually, it was a good live betting spot, kind of on both sides. But you didn't know that about Garcia for sure until it got really close to game time. So watching to make sure he's not playing was a good call there. And then the third thing is you can check your hunches. An example here is Buffalo is a team that can be pretty good when they're able to play fast and get a game sped up. When someone is able to slow them down, then they really struggle and are actually a team that I would want to stay away from. So let's say Buffalo's playing Akron, and I think Akron has what it takes to slow Buffalo down some. Well, if I watch the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game, I'm going to get a sense of whether that's true or not. Now, could it change in the second half? Adjustments are made? Of course, absolutely. But I do get a chance to check my hunches and see if I'm on point or not. So those are some reasons that you would want to live bet. Yes, to get a better line, but also to make better bets. You get more information, and I think your edges can increase in many scenarios, not all the time, but in many scenarios. So that's why you would do it. A couple things for you to consider if you're going to live bet college basketball. And these are things that if you've been live betting a lot, you know these things already. So this is more something I want to share for maybe people who are a little bit newer getting into this. Just things you want to pay attention to. And if you're just starting sports betting, I'm probably going to have some content coming out for just the very, very basics. But if you're just starting, some of these things you might not fully understand, but hopefully it won't be too tough if you've done any of this at all. So the first thing to consider is that the line is going to move more drastically the further you get into a game. So for instance, if I'll just use Iowa and Minnesota again, if Iowa gets up by 10, 5 minutes into the game, it's not going to move the line all that much. They were favored by 12 and a half anyway. So maybe it goes to minus, 14 and a half, 15 and a half. When you get more toward the end of the game, though, the difference between a team being up by 5 or being up by 8 is significant. And the line is going to move move in connection with each point that's scored much more. So where a team going up by from 3 to 4 when you're 5 minutes into the game might move a line from -110 to -115. It might just move the juice, not even move the points. If there's 3 minutes left in the game, going from 3 to 4 is going to move the line from 3.5 to 4.5. It's going to move the line a whole point. Now, this can be good because you could wait and say, hey, if it's going to move that much more when it gets down toward the end of the game, then all I need is a couple points to be scored and I can get a much better line. Yes, however, there's two problems with that. When a team scores near the end of a game, there's less opportunity for the other team to overcome it, which is why the line is moving that way, right? I mean, the books aren't doing it for no reason. Secondly, if you have a spot you like and you wait too long, you may entirely miss your shot at a better line, because by the time you come back around to wanting to bet it, the game has gotten away from you and you never get the chance to get the line you wanted because you waited too long. So just something to be aware of, that those lines are going to move differently early in the game and late in the game. The second thing is when you're live betting, the juice on the line jumps around a lot more. And it normally starts at 115 rather than 110. Now, again, this is not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes you'll get a line at -105. In live betting, often it'll go up to even -125. But you really need to pay attention to the juice. If you're only looking at the points, you're going to be missing out on how good a bet is or not. Because if you're getting a team at, let's say, +8.5, and the line is -105, or the line is -125, you're making a very different bet there. And so just be aware that in live betting, the line is going to jump around a lot, and you need to be aware of where it is, if that's a good bet or not. All right. Next up, I want to give you 4 tips for live betting. These are certainly not hard and fast rules, but just things that I think can help you to be successful if this is something you want to do. Number 1, if you can, watch the game. Now, certainly if you're live betting at any volume, and this is something I do, I live bet more games than I can watch. And that goes to, I have an approach to things that helps me know which games I should be watching and which ones might be less important. That'd be another video for another time or another podcast, however you're listening to this. But if you can watch the game, do that, because there's so much that can happen in a game. Number 1, there is a feel to games. There's just a reality to that. I talked about this earlier. The same 2 teams are going to have games that play out very different ways, and you can get a feel for what's happening. There are foul situations. I mean, if a team's best interior player, like let's say especially a team's going against Purdue, and Zach Edey, is dominant in the middle, and the other team only has one really good big man, and that big man gets 3 fouls 11 minutes into the game. Well, that is significant information, and it gives you an edge. You might not know that. I mean, you could be watching stats or game feeds, but if you're not watching the game, you're not going to know stuff like that. You won't know how a team is shooting. Again, you can look at stats for these things, but what the pace is, where there's momentum or not. Momentum is a big deal in college basketball. If you watch it enough, you know these teams go on runs, and it can be momentum based. So if you watch the game, you're going to have a better feel. Now, one caveat to this: if you already have a bet on a game or you're watching one of your favorite teams, one of the things you have to be careful of is getting too emotional and betting based on your emotions when you're watching the game. If your team goes down and you're pissed off, and so you're like, oh, they've got to come back, or they're terrible, they're going to just lose by 50. Well, that is going to make you either not make good bets or make bad bets. So if you can't keep your emotion out of it, maybe you don't want to watch the games, but if you can, watching the game can give you a lot of help. So that's number 1. Number 2, in live betting, be decisive. This is something that I've really been learning. Well, I've known it, but I'm getting better at recently, is when there's a spot that you've already determined is a good spot, you've got to go ahead and pull the trigger. One of the challenges of live betting, sort of like stock trading, is, okay, I see this stock moving down. I really believe it's going to move back up, but I want to buy it at the very lowest price point. Same thing in sports betting. It's like, man, this team that I like is going down, the other team's on a run, but I want to get every single point I possibly can. Well, obviously you do want to do that. However, if you're tentative, what's going to happen is you're not going to pull the trigger, and then the team you like is going to come back, and then you will have missed out on a good live betting situation. So if you like a spot and where it's at, pull the trigger. Being decisive, though, also means sometimes saying, this is not a good spot, and this would be a stretch, or I'm uncomfortable with it, or there are metrics that tell me this is not a good bet. Then don't pull the trigger. So you need to be decisive both ways, but don't just sit in the middle. Third tip, consider alt spreads at plus money. Now, this is a tip. This is a good example of one that I would not give in the same way in football that I do for basketball. This I could see for NBA or college basketball, but we're talking about college basketball here. Points matter for sure, but points matter less than they do in a sport like football. So if you can get a team, let's say plus 10.5 or plus 11.5, well, there is a certain amount of time that team is going to lose by 11 points. And if you got the 10.5, you lose your bet, and 11.5, you would have won it. That absolutely happens, and I don't want to downplay that. However, there are certain situations, and this is actually going to come in for the live betting strategy I'm going to share with you today. There are certain situations where if I can get plus 11.5 at minus 120 and plus 10.5 at plus 105, I have to consider, is that 1 point worth those 25 points in juice, or maybe it's 20 points. And I would say in college basketball, especially early in games, I don't think it's often worth it. So there are times where I will play a wider line where I really want to get a certain number, but I'm often looking to give up a single point, especially early in games, to get a plus money line. And that overall has worked out pretty well for me. So again, it kind of depends on your betting style. Some people might be like, no, I hate that. I want to get the point. Others might say, hey, I don't want to pay so much juice. That's worth it. It's up to your style, but it's something that I would say is worth considering. The last tip, check stats and fouls at halftime. This is a very easy thing to do. And if you can take a few minutes, especially in college basketball, a lot of games are going to halftime at the same time. If you can take 5 minutes or so, just scroll through, look at the shooting stats, look at the rebounding stats, look at the fouls. If there is an outlier that you see, then it might make for a good bet. Here's another example. Iowa was ahead of Minnesota by 5 points at halftime in their game this past week. And I don't remember the exact stats. I should have written them down, but Iowa was shooting something like 33% field goal percentage, 18% from three-point range, and 50% from the free throw line. Iowa is generally a good shooting team, so the chances of them not having positive regression in the second half are very low. Of course it can happen, but they're very likely to shoot better in that scenario. And so that is an example of a place that I think makes for a good live bet, because you have a reason why a team has not performed up to what they are capable of. So check stats and fouls at halftime, and that can potentially give you some good edges. All right, next we are going to move on to an actual betting strategy that I use. Before that, I just want to address, if you're watching the video, I have an IU hat on and a Minnesota sweatshirt. I am not trying to be a fair weather fan here. I grew up cheering for Minnesota teams, but have been in Indiana a long time, so I've adopted the Hoosiers as well. Obviously, this year it's a lot more fun being a Hoosiers fan than a Gophers fan. But anyway, if you don't like somebody having two teams on at once, I totally get it. I'd probably be there too, but life happens. Sometimes it works out that way. All right. No one really cares about that, so let's move on to the live betting strategy. And by the way, at the end of this, just if you're interested, I am going to talk a little bit about some ways I'm going to try to be helping people out with live betting. It doesn't cost anything, by the way, up front. Usually if you say that, it's like, hey, I'm going to make you pay for something. That's not the case. But hang in there for that at the end if you are interested in some help on this. All right. So 4 steps. Number 1, identify teams you believe will keep it close. So right here, I'm not as concerned about whether a team is favored or not. What I'm concerned about is whether I think a team is going to be able to hang in a game. Now, as with anything in betting, there is no way of guaranteeing this. Every team can get blown out at times. But what I want to do here is avoid teams that are likely to get blown out. That's what I really don't want. If a team gets blown out, like loses by 15 plus points once or twice in a whole year, and then they lose by 25 in the game that I live bet, so be it. That stuff happens, but it's not likely. So I want teams that are tough-minded, are going to hang in there, and I think can keep it close. You get the point. So you got to identify those teams ahead of time. Number 2, watch for large runs by the other team in the first 15 minutes. So this is a strategy that I generally abandon with about 5 minutes left in the first half. And that is because when the large runs happen that late, I don't have empirical evidence for this. So if you want to do it different, do it different. This is just the way I do it. I feel like they can tend to stick a little bit more. But in the first 15 minutes, if there are two teams that I think are going to play a close game and one of them goes on a 15-2 run, it's most likely to me that there will be a comeback in that scenario. And I'm actually going to give you an example of where this strategy worked well at the end of this, where I did. I'm sure I should give you an example of where it didn't work too, I suppose. I don't remember those right now, though I'm sure that it's happened. Number 3, wait for your team to call a timeout. When a team is on a big run, 7, 8, 9 points plus, generally that momentum is going to carry until the other team calls a timeout. So I'm going to wait for the other team that I'm not going to bet on to go on a big run, for my team to call a timeout, and then I'm going to look to live bet. And in this case, I will generally bet an alt line at plus money. The reason for this is that when a team goes up by a significant margin, what I see happen most often is either they keep the pedal down and they blow the team out, or that other team regroups, gets it together, pulls it back, and what you see is a game that ends closer to what the original spread was. And so in that case, to me, it makes sense to give up a point. Now, I'm not betting. I should have a caveat here. I'm not talking about betting an alt line at like plus 6,000. I'm talking about betting the best alt line I can get at plus 105, or plus 110, something like that, not plus 150, plus 190. You could think about doing that as well, but I prefer to just get the best plus money I can, plus 105, give up that 1 point, and then take the team that has gone down because of a run. So here's an example of where this betting strategy did work out. UNLV was playing San Diego State, and San Diego State was throttling them in the first half. I think that they got up by close to 30. I should have gone back and looked at the exact number, but the point is they were shooting, I think, 70% from 3-point range. They had turned UNLV over like 8 times or something. I mean, it was just absolute destruction. But UNLV generally plays pretty well on the road. And while San Diego State probably is a better team than they are, I don't think that they are drastically better. And so I expected UNLV to hang in there and make it a somewhat close game. So I waited and I bet UNLV plus 21.5 at plus 105. That game ended up, you could double check me, but I'm pretty sure that game ended up being an 11-point game. UNLV did what I thought, and they made a little bit of a comeback, and San Diego State still beat them soundly. I think the original spread was like 5.5. So if you bet that pregame, that was a loss. So that is a strategy that I've used that's worked pretty well, something you could try out, see if it works for you. Identify teams you think will keep it close, watch for large runs by the other team in the first 15 minutes, wait for your team to call a timeout, bet an alt line at plus money. All right. That is the bulk of the video there. But what I do want to say is if you go to my website, bigtastysports.com, you can sign up right at the top for a newsletter that I'm going to be starting. Well, I don't know if it's a newsletter. I'm going to send out emails periodically, probably like twice a week, just so you know what to expect. For now, it's not going to be every day. And obviously, you can always unsubscribe. But I'm going to be doing 2 things during college basketball season. One is I will sometimes send out pregame picks that I'm making with, and some thoughts about why, things that I put in articles that I write sometimes. The other thing, though, and I probably won't be doing as many articles on this. This is something that I'm going to more often do just for the email subscribers, is I'm going to point out some live betting targets. So those will be teams that I would just say, hey, here's a team that I think you should keep your eye on. I'll give you a little bit of why and how I might approach it. I'm not going to be saying bet them at this number or anything like that, because hopefully from this video, you get the idea that there are just way too many things that go into live betting to get that specific about it for me. But I will give some live betting targets. The reason that I hope that could be helpful to you is I talked here about how you need to live bet teams that you like in a certain situation or matchup. That can take a lot of work. So I'm doing that work almost every day. And so happy to share some of that with you. If it's something you're interested, again, just go to bigtastysports.com. Link is in the description. Sign up for the emails, and I will start sending those out a couple times a week. Please do, if you have not yet, if you've gotten to the end of this video, please subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be having more content like this come out that hopefully is helpful in how you can go about betting, not just picks and stuff. If you're on the podcast, please rate and review the podcast. I would greatly appreciate all of that. And if there's a video you'd like to see or something you'd like to see me talk about, drop that in the comments, DM me on Twitter, whatever it is. Be happy to do that. Thanks for watching, and good luck with all of your life.